And we're going to look at verse 10 to begin with. This is a section of the story that involves just before the destruction of Jericho. The spies have gone into Jericho. They are with Rahab at this point. And this is actually, I guess, an explanation to the spies about the circumstances in Jericho. We know that generally the people of Jericho feared God and feared the people of God. And we find out why in verse 10. It says, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you devoted to destruction. And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted. There was no spirit left in any man because of you, for the Lord your God, He is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." And so here are the people in Jericho. Now Jericho was a very large, wealthy, powerful city. It had great walls, which were defensive mechanisms to protect it. It was a very difficult city to defeat. They had a great amount of respect in the region. And here is this ragtag army that has come over the Jordan River that is not really a trained army. They do have implements of warfare now. By the way, where did they get those implements of warfare? That's part of what they made from the metals that were given to them by the Egyptians when they left Egypt. They made some trumpets according to God's instructions. They made their implements of warfare. They made the implements of the temple and the things that God instructed them to do with all the bronze and the metals that were given to them on their way out. And so that's where they got a hold of these. But we're talking about centuries they've been in bondage. These are not people who have a basis for which to train a powerful army, or even the knowledge that it takes to understand and carry out warfare all that effectively. And so here's this great fortified city that's terrified of this army of former slaves. Why? Why is their heart melted within them? And she explains, we heard what God did for you at the Red Sea. And so there's an aspect of this that shows that even the people who are not believers in the Hebrew God, not followers of the Hebrew God, understand the reality of what happened and understand its significance. I think I mentioned last week or the week before last that there is a large attempt by people today to explain away the parting of the Red Sea and to explain some physiological way in which this could have happened apart from a miraculous act. Listen, the people who were contemporaries, who lived at that time, who heard the story about what happened there, they were impressed. And it scared them. Because they understood that the only being that could do such a thing is a being of greater power than they. That doing the most that they can against this foe is likely to fail because this foe has a God working with them who can do things that man can't even imagine. I mean, again, think about that. If we were planning out our escape from Egypt, we would not have gone to the edge of the Red Sea. It was God who planned that route. That would have been a dead-end route that would have led you to certain destruction. You don't go into a place where you don't have any other way to escape. And yet that's what they did, and they were victorious because of God. The people of Jericho heard about that, understood that, and they feared God as a result of it. You know what the people of Israel should have done as a result of those things? They should have feared God as well. But again, not long after that happened, what did they do? They took some gold from their jewelry and they melted it and they had Aaron fashion it into a calf, and they bowed down to that calf and said, "This is the God that delivered us." And that makes an extremely powerful lesson about how tactile we are when we're in these bodies. We want to see something. We want to feel something. We want to have a physical relationship. So much so that they were willing to transfer the fear that belonged rightfully to God to an inanimate object that they had just formed. We need to be careful about being drawn into a physical religion like that. If the people who don't follow God can recognize that we need to fear God because He is powerful, then certainly the people who do follow God should be able to recognize that. Now, turn over to the 24th chapter of the same book here in Joshua. And this is getting to be the end of Joshua's time in leadership. He is about to die. And he is renewing the covenant that God made with them. They're in Shechem. He's renewing that covenant. There's this great speech that comes from that, which is, we're familiar with at least part of that speech. "Choose you this day whom you will serve." And so that's the context and where this is found. We want to look at verses 6 and 7 of Joshua 24. He's talking about the words of God. This actually goes all the way back to verse 2. And Joshua said to all the people, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel." And this monologue begins a discourse from God to the people that's being given through Joshua. And verses 6 and 7 says, "Then I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea. And the Egyptians pursued your fathers with chariots and horsemen to the Red Sea. And when they cried to the Lord, He put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt, and you lived in the wilderness a long time." And so God thinks it's extremely important to remind the next generation of those events. Now, they should have been reminded of those events already. But remember, this is the children of the people who have been delivered out of Egyptian bondage. And remember how quickly people can forget things. And so God is bringing to their remembrance. God is reminding them of what He has done. And He says, "I brought your fathers out of Egypt, and you came to the sea." And I think that underscores the thing that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks about what an odd place to be. Where now they have the sea on one side of them that they cannot cross, and the armies of Egypt on the other side of them that are certain to destroy them. He said, "You came to the sea." And then what did you do? You cried out to the Lord. And He put darkness between you and them. You'll remember that part of the story. That which they had been following actually moves around behind them at this point, and it becomes a barrier to the Egyptians. God Himself moved to protect them. And He reminds them of that. And in this place, He doesn't remind them so much about parting the sea and giving them dry land to go across on. What's He remind them of? The second half of the story. How He used the sea to destroy the Egyptians. Now, if I'm thinking about this, and I'm part of the next generation, and I'm having recounted to me the things that God did for my fathers, so that I understand that God is working for me, not against me. God reminding me of that which He did against the Egyptians is a way of showing that, yes, in fact, He has the ability to work against. He has the willingness to work against His enemies. And He has the power to effectively destroy them. Don't forget, God says, what I did to the Egyptians at the Red Sea, when I brought my judgment upon them. You cried out to the Lord. I put darkness between you and the Egyptians and made the sea come upon them and cover them. And your eyes saw what I did in Egypt. Your eyes, by the way, that was not the eyes of the generation that he was talking to. That was the eyes of Israel. And you lived in the wilderness a long time. How long was that? About 40 years. That generation died off. And we'll recall why that generation died off, because they wouldn't obey God. They had been delivered by God all up to that point. When they got to the Jordan River and God said, go in and take the land, they were scared to do what God told them to do. They didn't do it, and so instead they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. And they all died, never entering the promised land. Moses didn't even enter the promised land. There were only 2 people that were alive when these events happened that actually got to enter into the promised land. Joshua and Caleb. And there's a bunch of lessons in that as well. He is bringing all of these things to their remembrance so that they learn from them. God is one who can both deliver and destroy. How is that expressed in the New Testament? Think about that. We'll come back to it. Nehemiah chapter, we'll try to come back to it if my memory allows me to come back to it. Nehemiah chapter 9. Generally, anybody have a recollection about what's going on in the book of Nehemiah? Okay, they're rebuilding the walls. They're rebuilding the walls from the destruction of the nation and of Israel. Well, keep in mind why. Why were they carried away captive? Because they didn't obey God. And so his destructive power was used against them. They were carried away into captivity, and I think they spent 70 years in captivity. And then Cyrus becomes the king of Persia, and he lets a group go back with Ezra. And now Nehemiah rises up, finds out that Jerusalem hasn't been rebuilt, and he seeks and gets permission to go back and build the walls. And that's what's going on here. Chapter 9 specifically is dealing with a confession of sin on the part of the nation, where they're coming to grips with the fact that the reason they were in bondage to begin with was because of their own sins. And they're acknowledging their sins before God in this chapter. But we want to focus on verses 9, 10, and 11, because in the process of this, there's this big assembly, and they're fasting, and they're in sackcloth. They've thrown dust upon their heads as a sign of mourning. And it says in verse 2, the Israelites separated themselves from all foreigners and stood and confessed their sins and the iniquities of their fathers. And so this is a come to the Lord moment. They're acknowledging that it's their own shortcomings as a nation. And then verses 9, 10, and 11, they're recounting to him, well, verse 6, you're the Lord, you alone, you've made heaven and the heavens with all their host and the earth and all that's on it. So they start back at creation and acknowledging that he is the Lord, that he alone is the Lord, and they're talking about his power and all that he has done. Verse 9, you saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt. We're many generations removed from that, by the way. But they know that there's a direct lineage and connection all the way back to Abraham even. But certainly to Moses and the children of Israel who were in bondage in Egypt. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt. You heard their cry at the Red Sea. So that's the second time. Joshua 24, that's brought up as well, that when they got to the sea, the Egyptians were behind them. They cried out to the Lord for deliverance in that situation. He brings that up here. You saw the affliction of our fathers in Egypt. You heard their cry at the Red Sea, and performed signs and wonders against Pharaoh and against all his servants and all the people of his land. For you knew that they acted arrogantly against our fathers, and you made a name for yourself, as it is to this day. So all of these years removed, people still know the power of God because of the things that He did in Egypt and the Red Sea. They acted arrogantly against our fathers. You made a name for yourself, as it is to this day, and you divided the sea before them so that they went through the midst of the sea on dry land, and you cast their pursuers into the depths as a stone into mighty waters. And so both sides of the equation at the Red Sea are brought up in this context. Both the deliverance of God for those that called out to God, and the destruction of God against the arrogant. They're remembering both of those things. This one event, the crossing of the Red Sea, doesn't just show God's deliverance. That's the way we talk about it most of the time. It also shows God's judgment. That's why we're told about what happened to the Egyptians, so that we can see and learn and fear what happens when we become arrogant and we refuse to honor God as God. And so that's what's going on here in Nehemiah chapter 9, and that is an important lesson for them to learn. Now let's turn to the Psalms. Psalm 66. As you're turning over to Psalm 66, I'll simply mention the opening of the psalm. Shout for joy to God, all the earth. Sing the glory of His name. Give to Him glorious praise. Say to God, how awesome are your deeds. And so this is a psalm of praise and adoration to God because of the mighty things that God has done. And notice what verses 6 and 7 say. Well, let's go back to verse 5. Come and see what God has done. He's awesome in His deeds toward the children of man. He turned the sea into dry land. They passed through the river on foot. Do you notice how in this single verse there's a reference to both of these events together side by side, treating them as parallel events? He did it at the Red Sea. He did it at the river as well. This is part of the awesome works of God. He turned the sea to dry land. They passed through the river on foot. There did we rejoice in Him who rules by His might forever, whose eyes keep watch on the nations. Let not the rebellious exalt themselves. Remember what happened to the rebellious Egyptians? Listen, it doesn't get any more rebellious than a prophet of God coming to a ruler and saying, the Lord God says, let my people go. And the ruler saying, who is this Lord that you speak of? Why do I need to obey His voice? What did the Egyptian pharaohs believe about themselves? Essentially that they were deity on earth. And it got worse and worse and worse. By the way, that is a recurring theme in history. As more and more power was concentrated in a single individual, emperors across the board tend to start thinking of themselves in terms of deity. That's what happens when we get a little power. The psalmist says God's deeds are awesome, and again he turns their attention to the fact that He is ruling by might. We do serve a benevolent God and a God full of grace and mercy, and He shows grace and mercy. But listen, His grace and mercy are demonstrated by the restraint of His power. And we do have pictures of His power being unleashed against unbelievers. And the Red Sea is one of those examples. He keeps his eyes and watch over the nations. He knows what's going on. And the nations here, I believe, is all inclusive. That's the reason it's plural. He doesn't just keep his eyes on the nation Israel, but on the nations. All people. He knows what all of them are doing. Let not the rebellious exalt themselves. Nebuchadnezzar got kind of exalted in his attitude. What did God do? He humbled him. That is, I think God sees fit to bring us back into our place. And the process for that happening is not fun. It's through difficulty and hardship that we get disciplined and come to realize just how powerless we really are. So the psalmist talks about it there. Look over at the 78th Psalm. Psalm 78. If you have headings in your Bible, you might have something along the lines of, tell the coming generation, as your heading here. The idea being that this is a psalm that is a psalm of remembrance, of things that these are the things you need to tell the next generation. And look at verse 13. He divided the sea and let them pass through it, and made the waters stand like a heap. In the daytime he led them with a cloud, and at night with a fiery light. He split rocks in the wilderness and gave them to drink abundantly as from the deep. He's talking there about all the events surrounding their deliverance from Egypt and their time in the wandering. What's significant that he points out here? He divided the sea and let them pass through it. I love that language. This was not something that they did. This was something that God made possible and God allowed. He let them pass through. You know what he didn't do? He didn't let the Egyptians pass through. They tried. But he stopped it. And so think about that and think about what that means. The 106th Psalm. I'm a firm believer that all of these things are inspired by God. So don't misunderstand or misconstrue what I'm about to say. But knowing that David wrote most of the Psalms, I would suggest to you that when we see this brought up continuously through the Psalms, that it's something that David kept himself constantly aware of. Why do you think he might have done that? Maybe to keep himself humble? 106 Psalm verses 9 and 10 to begin with. Give thanks to the Lord. That's what this is about. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. That's the opening words of this psalm. His steadfast love endures forever. This is another psalm of praise for all that God has done. Verses 9 and 10. He rebuked the Red Sea, and it became dry. He led them through the deep as through a desert. So he saved them from the hand of the foe and redeemed them from the power of the enemy. Do you notice those two statements? There's a parallel aspect to them. Sure, Egypt was the enemy, but I think this is much deeper than that. Who's the real adversary of man? The devil. Satan. Which means adversary. He's introduced way back in Genesis 3 as the adversary of man. He's talked about all the way through the Bible as the adversary of man, and he's certainly presented that way in the New Testament. And when he says he redeemed them from the power of the enemy here, that's kind of taking it a step further. This couplet I think, is demonstrating two things. He saved them from the hand of the foe. He delivered that generation from Egypt and redeemed them from the power of the enemy. There was something more going on. There was something much deeper happening, which, by the way, wasn't fully realized until when? Until the cross. All of this has messianic overtones. Look down a little bit further. Verses 21 and 22. They forgot God, their Savior, who had done great things in Egypt, wondrous works in the land of Ham, and awesome deeds by the Red Sea. When they forgot about these works of God, when they didn't pull them into their remembrance regularly, that's the periods of time that they became arrogant, and that's the period of time that they stumbled and fell away from God, that they started doing what was right in their own eyes instead of living the way that God asked them to live. And over and over and over and over and over again, that refrain comes throughout the history of Israel. That God delivers them, that they become arrogant and forget God, that God disciplines them, that they call out to God for deliverance again, that God delivers them. Then they get arrogant and they forget about God. They begin doing what they want to do. God brings them under judgment. They fall back. Over and over again. Through the period of the wilderness wanderings, through the period of the taking of the land, through the period of the judges, through the period of the kings. Just over and over and over again. If that happened to them over and over and over again, do we really think that we're not exposed to the same problem? At any point in time, I am convinced that there are people sitting in our assemblies, part of our local congregation, who are in periods of struggle with their faith. Who are beginning to think more of themselves and this world than about what God has done. And that's why we have the job to be aware of what's going on around us, to be aware of our brethren, to be ready to bear their burdens, to be ready to help them and set them back in place. Take the joint which has been put out of joint and set it back in place is the imagery that's used in the New Testament. Because the same exact thing happens to us. And the psalmist understood that and wanted to talk about it. By the way, since how we've talked about some of these things, back up just a little bit, verses 19 and 20. We read verses 21 and 22. Because 22 is the one that specifically mentions the Red Sea. But listen to this. They made a calf in Horeb and worshipped a metal image. They exchanged the glory of God for the image of an ox that eats grass. That also happened to that generation. And we've talked about that in the course of our discussion, and so we'll pull those verses in as well. All of those things that God is doing and all of the things that the people did in response are teaching us about what God is doing for us and how we respond to it. We need to think about it. Look at the 136th Psalm. Some of these start getting real short, by the way. When I was looking through this material, I started reading the 135th Psalm, thinking I was at Psalm 136. I was not there. So we have to be in the 136th Psalm for this to make any sense at all. Verses 13, 14, and 15. This is another one. Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good. This is another psalm of praise and adoration and recognition for all that God has done. And in verses 13 through 15, it says this: To him who divided the Red Sea in two, for his steadfast love endures forever. Do you notice that it shows that his actions there at the Red Sea were an expression of his love? His letting them pass through the Red Sea was an expression of his love. Just like God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. His deliverance of us, his allowing us to be delivered. Listen, not one of us can deliver ourselves on our own. If we're delivered, it's by his power and because he's allowed us to be delivered. He divided the Red Sea in two. His steadfast love endures forever. He made Israel pass through in the midst of it, for his steadfast love endures forever. Pick up a theme here. He overthrew Pharaoh and his host in the Red Sea, for his steadfast love endures forever. That whole event, both the deliverance of the Israelites and the judgment against the Egyptians, an expression of God's love. There's a hard one to wrap your head around. Think about that last verse for a moment. How is the carrying out of God's judgment an expression of his love? Think about that. It actually reflects something that we talked about a little bit earlier, about the things that we need to understand about the nature of God. The expression of God's care, concern, and love isn't all just the mercy and the grace. It's also the fury and the judgment and the vengeance. That's his love too. The New Testament affirms that we need to be aware of God and be aware of both what? The good that he's done and his judgment. To those who love God, mercy and favor. To those who do not, destruction and vengeance. All of it's an expression of God's love. Now we'll move over to the New Testament. And we're going to look at Acts chapter 7 to begin with. Acts chapter 7, of course, is the record of Stephen's sermon, the sermon that got Stephen stoned to death. And in verse 36, the text records this. Well, now back up to verse 35. Then Moses, whom they rejected, saying, "Who made you a ruler and a judge?" And that has reference back to something we read in the build-up, the foundation work to get here, where he is talking to them about what they shouldn't do, and that's their response to him. Who made you a ruler and a judge? He said, "This man God sent as both ruler and redeemer by the hand of the angel who appeared to him in the bush. This man led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. And so, in Stephen's preaching of the gospel message, he understood that having an awareness of what God did in those days through Moses in Egypt was foundational in understanding what God is doing to deliver us and save us today. He says, don't forget about this. And don't forget about the fact that the people initially rejected Moses. By the way, they started grumbling against Moses later too. He led them out, performing wonders and signs in Egypt and at the Red Sea and in the wilderness for 40 years. Hebrews chapter 11, that great chapter of faith. We sometimes talk about this in terms of being the Hall of Fame of faith. I don't know if that's a good designation for it or not, but it helps you remember what Hebrews 11 is about. There's just a litany of people that are set forth as examples of their faithfulness. And notice down in verse 29, by faith the people crossed the Red Sea on dry ground. By the way faith played a role in it is God told them, go forward. God told Moses, raise up your staff over the water. When they did what God told them to do, which is what it means to act by faith, then these things happened. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, but the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. And so again, we start seeing a pattern in the discussion and the teaching about this event throughout both Old and New Testament that uses both the deliverance of the Israelites and the destruction of the Egyptians to help us understand something. Listen, the people of God who acted by faith, who were following the commands of God by faith, they were saved. But the unbelievers were destroyed by doing the exact same thing. The Egyptians, listen to it again, when they attempted to do the same, they were moving forward just like the Israelites were moving forward. They were walking through the sea just like the Israelites were walking through the sea. They were following the commands of God. From a technical standpoint, someone watching from afar off would say that the Egyptians were doing the exact same thing that the Israelites were doing. What was the difference? The Israelites were acting on faith, the Egyptians were not. Listen, it's not the doing of the thing, it's the doing of the thing by faith that makes a difference. If I'm just confessing because everyone else confesses, that's not what's going to deliver me. If I'm just being baptized because someone told me that I should, or because I know it'll make someone in my family happy, that's not going to deliver me from my sins. The Egyptians found out that it wasn't just walking through the midst of the sea. The difference between these two groups was one did it by faith and one did not. And the very same things that deliver you are your judgment. I think there's an allusion to that with the discussion about the Lord's Supper as well, when it says that if we do it unworthily, then we're making bringing judgment upon ourselves. The proclamation that Jesus is the Christ, which is what the Lord's Supper is about, the proclamation that He died for our sins and rose on the third day to deliver us from sin. When I am not a believer, when I am not following God by faith, to make that proclamation is to denounce judgment upon myself. Just like making that proclamation, if I am acting by faith, is a celebration of my deliverance. We have to understand that these are things that we cannot do on our own, that these are things that God allows us to do. And that what makes them effective is God. And us putting our trust and confidence in God and His Word. I've got to stop there. I will tell you, we're going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and then we'll be wrapping this up. So we'll probably move into another section of the study next Lord's Day morning. Nope, not next Lord's Day morning. The Lord's Day morning after that. And we'll wrap this up and move on. But Any questions or comments or things that you want to bring into this discussion that I have not, that'll be a good time to do it. Yes, ma'am.